Hey there, and welcome to the Hour of History podcast. I'm your host, Stephen Bauman. Sitting down with me today is Dr. Herb Childress, who is the author of the book, The Adjunct Underclass: How America's Colleges Betrayed Their Faculty, Their Students, and Their Mission. It's a fascinating read, like all of Herb's other books, and I'm sure you'll find it enlightening. We'll have links and more information for you at hourofhistory.com. As usual, if you have any suggestions or any guests you'd like to hear on the show, head over to hourofhistory.com/contact and drop us a line. I'm more than happy to have a number of historical subjects on the show, and I think it's great to hear your feedback. Special shout out to our listeners from Australia for this episode. You guys are the best. So on Hour of History, it's our world, anytime, any place. Enjoy the conversation, and if you're an adjunct, keep your chin up. Hopefully there are solutions out there. Have a great one.
You're listening to the Hour of History podcast.
Our world, anytime, any place.
With your host, Stephen Bauman, and producer, James Abel. The Hour of History is a member of Episodic Network, an association of fun, interesting, and informative podcasts. EpisodicNetwork.com. Without further delay, your Hour of History starts right now.
Hello, and welcome to Hour of History. I'm sitting here with Dr. Childress. How are you doing today?
Things are very good, thank you. How are you?
I'm doing well, and I'm fascinated by this topic. I mean, rather than, I think we're going to get to your background anyway, so I'd like to just jump right in with the title of your new book, The Adjunct Underclass: How America's Colleges Betrayed Their Faculty, Their Students, and Their Mission. Tell me a little bit about that title.
That's a fairly clear statement of where things are. No, it's... The original title was much more neutral. It was simply going to be called Contingent, and we hadn't talked about a subtitle at all. And as we worked our way through it, my editor at Chicago and I, we really talked about wanting to foreground the emotional resonance of all of this within the intellectual factual argument. And as I've been doing interviews for a couple of years on this project, I really see the ways in which adjunct faculty, postdocs, visiting scholars, all of the people who are in the contingent world are seen as welcome to participate in this very delimited way. There really is a degree to which they're seen as helpers rather than as full members of a community. And so that notion of an underclass, that notion of people who we will happily absorb their labor without actually giving them the benefits of membership, became more and more and more central to the idea of the book.
And so already there, it's not just the adjunct. You have a whole lot of contingent labor, but adjunct really kind of has a piercing nature to at least my ears. How did you decide adjunct versus contingent?
Well, I mean, so the language is really interesting. The notion of adjunct, which it means that something that is a component of a phenomenon, but not an integrated core part of its definition, right? Something is adjunct to something larger. So there is that real sense of being part of, but not really definitionally included, right? But as I go in through the larger issue of the book, there are an awful lot of people who are in that boat who don't fit the traditional model of the semester by semester, course by course contract, but who still have a very tenuous and easily removed relationship to the community. So you've got term faculty, people who are full-time but know that their gig is only going to be a year or 2 years. You've got postdocs, you've got grad students who are part of the community under very delimited specific terms and whose survival is not in any way ensured in the longer term. So adjunct is a recognizable term, but I think one of the things I'm trying to do is broaden what we mean by that.
Yeah, and there are a lot of these people who are teaching, and teaching at a close to the highest level in education who aren't always around. What is this from the perspective of the college? Why would a college sort of be okay with this sort of setup?
Well, I think there are a lot of reasons. One of the things I tried to do in this book is to avoid the sort of what I call combat narrative of the evil administrator and the beleaguered faculty. I think we're seeing an ecological change, and an awful lot of things are changing in higher ed and beyond higher ed that make this sort of seem normal. So one of the things that we see is that the contingent community, the adjunct community, is most often focused on courses that are in students' first year, most often focused on courses that are easily transferred to other schools or come in from other schools. And so there's a real sense that the permanent faculty are reserved for upper division students, are reserved for graduate students, and that those first year students, first and sometimes second year students, we don't know if we should make a commitment to them because we don't know if they'll be back next year, right? 25% of college freshmen in America don't become college sophomores, right? So there's a way in which I think there's the first year is seen as a testing ground for everybody. Right?
And yeah, one of the interesting things about your book is that it's not just for one group. You know, I think it'll be relevant and interesting to college administrators, to faculty, and to students as well. What do you take away as the sort of way students feel this being taught in that crucial first year by someone who is knowledgeable but just starting, or not at the top of the
right. And one of the things I want to be really clear about, both from personal experience and from the research, is that there is no meaningful way to say that adjunct faculty members are worse in the classroom than their permanent counterparts. A lot of contingent faculty are really, really terrific. In many cases, they have to be, or they won't be brought back, right? So the issue is that what happens in that first year of college, what happens is much broader than what happens within the context of any given classroom in any given semester, right? Students in really fundamental ways are making a decision about whether or not they want to join a community, right? Do I want to be part of this club? Do I want to be, whether that's the college educated club in general or the major or the discipline in particular, right? There's a real sort of identity building thing going on there. And that's one of the traditional roles of mentorship. It's not about teaching, it's about welcoming somebody to the club. It's about saying, this is how we live here. These are the pleasures of how we live and how we think. And you could be part of it too. And I see you're interested. Come on in. Let me show you some more, right? So what's lost is not just within the individual classroom, right? I think that I'm not so worried about. What's lost is that sense for incoming students that there's a body of people who live here who are going to welcome me in and make me feel like I might belong and I might have a home here too. So these folks who are teaching contingently typically only have that one opportunity to see a student. And they oftentimes, especially in the more traditional adjunct semester by semester, course by course, they don't have an office, they don't have office hours, they're working on 2 and 3 campuses at a time. And so that sense of welcome, that sense of, initiating people into an intellectual life is really hard to sustain.
And it brings to mind that sort of image that at least I have, and I know other people share if they haven't lived through it, of the adjunct carting around, maybe a shopping cart-like device full of folders and books, and because there is no office, or using the car like you described for a nap and for a meal because there is no office. As someone or someone who has worked in the college setting in administration, why isn't there a place for adjuncts?
Well, anytime we allocate space, anytime we allocate resources, we're doing it in the context of other space and resource needs, right? And so universities are fairly voracious creatures. There's always a demand for a new office or a new program, which has to be staffed, which has to be funded. And so it's easy to lose track of the sort of day-to-day lives of the people who are working with our students. I know that the school that I worked at most recently in Boston, we did have a quote-unquote faculty lounge, which was literally 3 chairs and 1 computer, and it was a place where you could kind of get yourself together and drink a Coke before you go into class, but it was in no way a place to offer a stable home to work with students, right? I think that one of the things that we're seeing is a real growth in higher ed in not administration, not deans, not provosts, but non-instructional professionals, people in student services, people in co-curricular academic services like undergraduate research and service learning and community engagement and support for first-year experience, things like that. All of those require space, all of those require staff, and are seen as things that may have as much impact as what we do in the classroom. So it's easy to steal space from the people who are kind of least empowered.
Yeah, it's a fascinating kind of thing, and a lot of schools don't even have that space for a Coke before going out to class. Yet at the same time, we see, like you said, this sort of voracious monster, or you said creature, a little kinder, building up. I mean, my alma mater, where I did my undergrad, Louisiana State University, just built a massive pool in the shape of LSU. Significant amount of space, and that is not necessarily for the administration, but for the student as a consumer. How does that play into the university mindset?
Right. Well, I mean, it's interesting, and it's easy to point at the sort of silly examples like that, and the sort of the winding brook that runs through campus, blah blah blah. But the fact of the matter is that colleges everywhere are competing for students. I mean, we ran out of babies about 20 years ago. The birth rate really started to drop in the early 90s, and it dropped again really sharply during the Depression. So the peak number of high school graduates took place in America around 2007, 8, 9. And we're not going to get back to those levels until the mid-2030s. And so every school that's not at the sort of most selective end of the range is fighting to make their numbers. They're fighting to make their incoming class. And so if you're competing for students from a broad geographical range, I mean, out-of-state students and international students look really good paying out-of-state tuition in the context of budget crises. So if you're competing for students, and your classes and your curriculum are more or less the same as everybody else's, what do you have to compete with? Amenities.
Absolutely.
Better service, better dormitories, a more attractive physical campus, a bright, shiny new science building that you can photograph and take students through on a tour, right? Those are business tools. Those are recruitment tools. They're easy to photograph. They're easy to put in the brochure, and are easy to communicate in a way that intellectual quality is harder to communicate. It's harder to photograph intellectual quality.
Yeah, and so do you see that, like, the percent is getting up there of contingent faculty or contingent teachers, and it's I think some people estimate as much as 3/4 are part-time. Do you see that as like another, in the age of YouTube stars, maybe just getting 1 or 2 superstar professors that are flying around and recruiting students all over the globe?
That's an interesting notion. The analogy that I make to YouTube and Instagram is that a lot of people work for free in the hopes of being discovered, right? And a lot of the adjunct faculty that I talked to for this project talked about the way in which they felt as though there was some vague promise that if they did well, that they would be considered for the next permanent faculty opening. There was a sort of, foot in the door kind of notion that almost never paid off and almost never does. Once you come in as a contingent faculty member of any stripe, you are seen as a contingent faculty member rather than a potential partner. But as you say, the American Association of University Professors estimates that about 3/4 of people in classrooms are something other than permanent tenured faculty members. Now that includes, again, adjuncts, term limited full-time jobs, teaching postdocs, grad students, all people whose membership is not assured, right? So I don't know the degree to which the star faculty member is the driver of this. But I think certainly that when colleges talk about their faculty to incoming students, they are talking about those handful who are permanent, who are tenured, who are recognized. I think I don't know that that's a driver. I think that may be an impact instead. I'm not sure.
And it leads then, if you're part of this 75%, if you sort of don't get into the club, what you've kind of termed this life in exile. Can you explain that phrase?
Well, there's a way in which, just as I described earlier about students trying to figure out if they want to be members of this community, part of becoming a scholar is becoming a member of the intellectual world, is becoming a member of your disciplinary society, is becoming a member of your department. And there's a way in which we really, we build our identities around the kinds of work that we aspire to, around the kinds of thinking that we aspire to, around the kinds of research products that we value. That becomes our self-definition. That becomes who we are. And so when that identity is ruptured, when that identity is no longer available to us, that's a really wrenching moment. It's a really wrenching experience. And the difficulty with contingency is that it's not a one-time experience, right? It's not like a divorce where you're just, you were part of this club and tomorrow you're not. And you have to grieve about that. You have to deal with that. But you really, you're done with it, right? Mm-hmm. The nature of being contingent in higher ed is that you get to relive that divorce every day, right? You're always in, but not really in. And you recognize that the entry to the door is actually further and further away the more you participate, right? So you're held adjacent to the mansion to do the work that your betters would prefer not to do, right? Yeah. And that's a particularly wrenching experience. Right. I've really only started to recover from this after I was fully able to say, I'm done. I am no longer part of this. I no longer see myself having a future in this community. And then you go through the process of grieving about that, and eventually you come out the other side and you're ready. But as long as I was inside, it was really, really hard. And being a college administrator, I'll say this, it is not intellectual life, right? It's running a business. It has more in common with running a restaurant or a branch bank than it does with intellectual life that we were trained for. And so I always talked about administrative life as like living next door to your old girlfriend, right? You get to see her every day, but you're always reminded of the life you're never going to have.
And I think that's, that's a really good example of why, your writing is so fun to read. And maybe we can get into your personal story a little bit, because it is a personal book. And you struggled with this from the beginning of your sort of academic life, where you had this creative writing talent that was, it's not really accepted in the business. So yeah, can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, that is funny. I recognize now that for the last 30 years I've been a writer, and I just felt like I needed a job title in order to make that legitimate. But I've always had this sense of wanting to tell stories, of wanting to deal not merely with the facts of nonfiction, but with the implications, right? Joseph Stalin famously said that the death of an individual is a tragedy and the death of a million is a statistic, right? And so I wanted to play both sides of that line. I wanted to be able, both in my research writing, my ethnographic work, and in this work, to be able to say, yes, here is the body of facts. You need to know this. You need to know that this is a national trend. You need to know what it looks like. And you need to know why it matters, right? Which is why I went into ethnography as a sort of core method for the work that I did. I spent a year living in a high school in Northern California, hanging out with kids when I was in my 30s, watching them navigate the physical world. How did they use their homes? How did they use their school? How did they use their community? And what did that tell us about the differing values of the adolescent world and the adult world? Right. And so that desire to sort of live among people and to try to tell their stories to a larger group, it's kind of like translation, right? You have to know this language enough to be able to speak it to that other language.
But when you're telling the story to the larger group, it seems that the goal, is you want to tell as many people as possible, but
right.
That's not really the goal of academics.
It's absolutely true. And, I have a friend who's going through this right now. She literally just last Thursday completed a brilliant dissertation in history. And there is, I think, enormous potential to tell this story in a public way, in a way that illuminates all of our understanding about the Civil War, and complicates what we think we know. And she really has a desire to do that. She's a really talented writer. She's really captured part of the world that most of us don't know. And she's being strongly encouraged by her committee to not choose that route, to go through an academic press that focuses on Southern United States history and she needs to make her bones in the intellectual community rather than as an illuminator of the world to the general public. One of the great things now about not being part of higher ed is that I have a lot more latitude in what I write about. I don't have to be tied to a discipline, but I have enormous latitude in how I write it, right? And so when my editor and I first were working on this book together, as before the proposal was even put together, we really configured it as a general readership book. And a lot of the attention it's gotten has been within higher ed because, of course, it's about our industry, it's about our work. But my goal is that, here we are at this particular moment where we have $1.5 trillion in student debt. We have 3 colleges just here in Southern Vermont closing in the last 2 months. We have people cheating their way into USC. I think it's time for a conversation around what the hell this college stuff is about, what it's for, who should participate. So I think it's come at a really fortunate moment when a lot of people are really puzzled around what this college thing is.
Now, one thing you don't do is you don't blame the contingent faculty ever. And that's kind of like one of those old tropes. Well, no one has to work as contingent faculty.
Right.
Presumably they can get another job. Why do people continue to work as adjuncts?
I think a lot of it is the identity question that we raised, right? You don't have to stay in an unhappy marriage either. But oftentimes people do because they're getting something from it. And what I think we get from our contingent participation is a sense that we still do have a chance, a sense that we still are part of this world that we worked so hard to enter. There's a really wonderful old essay by Irving Goffman about how con men work with people after they've discovered that they've been conned. And there's 2 really common methods around this. One is to allow them to be a sort of member of this thing that they had tried to become, in a different mode, but, we still think you're okay. We still value you. And the second is we give them another chance. We say, oh, well, it didn't work this time, but next time we've got it for sure. Well, in higher ed, the first one of those, where we'll give you a role that's not really the role you wanted, is what we call the adjunct or the postdoc or the visiting scholar, right? Mm. And the second role, where we say, oh, there's always another chance, we call that the postdoc, right? We'll keep you around. You do this really well. You're really positioned to step right into the faculty, And so those are two common methods for helping people deal with the disappointment of having been cheated, of having lost something that they legitimately should have gotten, and still kind of feel okay about it.
And do you see this as a unique thing that higher ed is different than, say, other companies or other businesses?
I don't know. Certainly there are an awful lot of people in every industry who end up taking roles that are adjacent to what they thought they were going to do. There are a lot of people who work in theaters who wanted to be actors or who wanted to be musicians and find a way to remain adjacent to that life. One of my uncles, who I didn't know very well, had a music degree from the University of Texas, and ended up with a career as a television station sound manager, right? So I do think there is a sense in which if you work really hard to make yourself into a particular kind of a person, you will find ways to continue to try to be that kind of a person.
And we've seen this, or that sort of attachment to that identity or to that end goal. I'm going to make myself be that kind of person, have tremendously devastating effects. Recently, there was that article in The Atlantic, The Death of an Adjunct.
Oh, what a gruesome story. Oh.
Yeah, and you must hear stuff like that all the time from your research.
Yeah, it's true. It's absolutely true. And even since the book has come out and since the excerpt in the Chronicle has come out, my inbox has just been full of those kinds of stories of people saying, yeah, I thought it was my fault too. And I'm really slowly starting to understand that this is bigger than just me. And we don't talk about it broadly very much. And so we do feel ashamed. We do think that it's just us, that somehow we did something wrong, which again is part of every abusive relationship, right? If I do something right, then my partner will love me or stop beating me. It's a real easy narrative to construct because it gives us some agency, right? If I do this next thing right, then I have a chance, right? It's hard to be in an environment that's kind of like a natural disaster where the world has just collapsed around you and there really wasn't much that you could have done. Right? So blaming yourself is one form of agency. It's one form of saying, I had control. I didn't do it right, but I had control. I was in charge of my own fate.
And certainly one of the things that you talk about is even if you do everything right, there's a very small chance that you get to the next level. But even once you get to the next level, there's still a small chance that you get to the next level. Is it always just over the horizon in higher ed?
Well, I mean, like any one of the things that you'll discover probably is that I use metaphors in profligacy. We play the lottery because somebody does win, right? There is somebody on the other end who every so often pulls down $300 million, and we see that and we think, yes, that could be us, right? So people do make it through the process. People do go through from star undergraduate to star graduate student to successful postdoc to being a member of the faculty, right? That does happen. It's not impossible by any means. But the numbers are just so remarkably bad, right? That we're putting 55,000 new PhDs a year into a marketplace that maybe can accept 10,000 as new full-time tenure-track faculty, right? That's just raw arithmetic.
Yeah.
Right. And, even though that sounds bad, it's worse than that because, of course, you're competing against all the people that didn't get jobs the year before that, or the year before that, or the year before that. So you're in this enormous pool of people trying to compete for a fairly scarce resource. A friend of mine who teaches math says, how many mathematicians does it take to change a light bulb? Only one, but 612 applied. That's what we're facing. Right.
Mm.
And so one of the things in the book is trying to help people understand at least how best to position themselves to have a little bit better odds. Right. What is it that when your CV and your cover letter lands in a box in a pile of 200 for a search committee, right? It's not about being the best person in that box. It's about having a chance to even be read. Right. What's going to make your pile come to the top third of that 200 that will actually give you a chance to be considered, right? So totally what school you went to, what department you went to, and the reputation of those two things. The reputation of your particular faculty mentor totally matters. So your degree is read in three ways. I have a PhD in discipline from department and university, studying under famous scholar, right? All three of those things carry some weight, right? And one of the things that I totally didn't know, because I'm completely, first generation in college, much less grad school, I didn't realize the reputational value of those things. So I got accepted to grad school at Berkeley and at the University of Wisconsin at Milwaukee. And I was convinced at that time and remain convinced that the UWM program was a better program. I had a terrific time there. I loved it. I loved every bit of it. But it didn't have the name value, didn't have the sort of hood ornament cachet of a PhD from Berkeley. Right? I was talking with my editor at the beginning of this project, and I was talking about a friend who had gotten her PhD in 2012 and hasn't been able to sort of make that step into the faculty. And as I was talking with her, my editor said, well, she got a PhD in anthropology from the University of Massachusetts. She never had a chance. Right? And there's a real way in which, with so few faculty positions being open, Yale and Columbia and Harvard and Berkeley and Stanford and Northwestern can totally populate all of them.
Yeah.
Right? There's no need to go shopping at a bottom quarter of the field school.
And so what role in this then do you attribute to the existing faculty who one of their jobs is to recruit students and tell them of potential outcomes?
Well, part of the allure of going in intellectual life is that it's perceived as being sort of free from the constraints of the world, right? We have an unlimited amount of time to study this remarkably compelling small problem that we've focused on. And so if it takes us 3 years to write our book, if it takes us 5 years to write our book, that's fine. The quality of the work is all that matters. And so that attitude leads us to not be frank about the business as a business. Right? It's very, very rare that we have serious conversations with students about the job market, what it looks like, how to position yourself, how to write a cover letter that will speak to a particular audience. Right? Your cover letter is not one thing that you photocopy and send to 12 different schools. Your cover letter needs to be tailored like any research proposal. This is what I want to do. This is why you're the right partner for it. This is how you'll benefit from it, right? But that kind of strategizing around how to build your work materials, about being introduced to your colleagues at conferences and, making those connections between senior scholars in other schools and our graduate students. That just doesn't rise to the surface because I think we don't see it as a business. We don't see it as a network, which it absolutely is. We see it as this sort of life of the mind. And so we don't talk about the life of the wallet.
Yeah, or the life of the connections, which is an interesting part of your story, and one that hopefully people start talking about more. But a lot of these connections people have from having academic parents, and you didn't have that.
I was really struck when I got my postdoc at Duke when I was 44 years old. Everybody else was in their late 20s or early 30s. And I kept hearing in conversation, I kept hearing my colleagues talk about something that their mother had done as the dean of some school, or something that their father had done as a faculty member of some school. And it was this constant background noise. It was like a refrigerator running in the background. And so I literally ended up going door to door and say, what did your parents do for a living? And 14 of the 26 had one or both parents who had been involved in higher ed. And there were only 2 of us who came from working class families. Right? So in many ways, at the most elite levels, it's really a family business. It's like mortuary work, right? You pick it up from your parents and you keep doing it. And you get to, you know the term cultural capital, the idea that what you know in the context that you have investment value. Well, that's generationally acquired. Right? Cultural capital, like any trust fund, comes to you because of what your parents and what your grandparents knew, and the doors that they could help you open, and the world that they illuminated that you could walk into. And so for a lot of senior faculty members, they came from elite institutions, and in many cases came from white collar, and in often cases faculty family backgrounds. And so that world is just, it's a native language, right? It's the conversations you have over dinner.
And you talk about age too, where there's this window of age where you kind of fit the expectation of what a tenure-track professor looks like.
Yeah, and especially as you go into the higher level schools, if you go into the major research universities, there is that trajectory of the Wunderkind, of the person who knew from the womb that they wanted to study something. One of my very favorite faculty members at Berkeley got her faculty position after her PhD when she was 26. She was tenured when she was 31, right? And so for somebody who got his bachelor's degree at 31 and PhD at 38 and first postdoc at 44, that just looks weird. It doesn't fit our image of what a faculty member looks like. And I didn't really quite understand this. When I was at Berkeley, I was finishing up my undergrad, and I was talking to my terrific, great mentor there, Paul Groth, and talking to him about thinking about going to a doctoral program. And he said, well, if you start now, when you finish, you'll be 35 or 36. That's not too old. Right? So that should have been a little bit more of a red flag for me than it was. I thought, no, that's not too old. No problem. I didn't hear this sort of spoken subtext underneath that, which is like, dude, you're right on the border. Right?
Yeah. I think anyone who's pursued this path has had those moments, but just like most of life, they don't really make sense until much later. When I was first, visiting schools that I had been accepted to, I went to one lecture. It was a public lecture, and one of the professors there raised her hand after the talk, and she said, "The PhD is dead."
Not to be too blunt about it.
Yeah, but at the time I thought, well, she's probably right, but that doesn't mean it's dead for everyone. I was the exception. Is it true though? Is the PhD? What's the outlook here?
Well, gosh, everybody's crystal ball is a little bit faulty. There's the Bowen report from 1989. William Bowen, who had been the president of Princeton and had then become the president of the Mellon Foundation, wrote a book in 1989 outlining the deep, deep crisis in the production of college faculty that we just weren't going to have nearly enough qualified college faculty to meet the demand over the course of the next 20 years. And that report drew hundreds of thousands of people to graduate school who discovered that that prediction was completely wrong. Right. I think that what we're going to see, right, Clayton Christensen, who's in the Harvard Business School, has made this sort of gaudy prediction that half of American colleges will be gone in the next 20 years. I think he's overshooting the mark by a fair bit, but I think that there are a lot of smaller schools that are endangered, that we will see a continuing reduction in the herd. And I think the same thing is likely to happen in doctoral programs, where there's, the National Research Council shows that there's about 4,800 departments nationwide that are qualified to offer a PhD. And really, in terms of the job market, it probably ought to be 500. Because it's really only those students from the very best schools who have the best shot at getting through the door. So I think we may see a retraction in doctoral programs. I think that the work is still worthy work. The possibility of being a faculty member, the importance of being a faculty member is still worthy. But I think we will rediscover the raw facts of arithmetic. And we will recognize, I think, how badly we've overstocked the lake.
Now, on the other hand, a very prominent political talking point is, free education for all. College education should be free. That seems to be the opposite of the trend of higher education.
Tell me more about what you mean by that.
So if we're talking about, these small schools are closing and only 500 graduate programs could provide, professors to the whole world, or to the whole United States for sure. How does that mesh with people saying, well, there's not enough people in college? Would a universal college education solve this problem, or is it only going to make things worse?
Well, so, after just before World War II, only about 10% of high school graduates went to college. It was really for the sons of the wealthy. And after the war, the GI Bill, the increasing sense that college was to be democratized, the growth of the state higher ed systems and the community colleges in the 1960s, there has been this move toward democratizing the experience, right? That college should be for all, right? But what we mean by that is really radically changed, right? The experience that we offer to students, once you democratize a phenomenon, you're often going to deliver a slightly watered down or different version of it, right? And so a lot of let me rethink how I'm going to say this. For me, the idea of college is like the idea of restaurant. It covers an enormous array of experiences. And that's not to say that any of those experiences are bad ones, but they are radically different. And they offer you a different set of prospects for what comes next, right? And so community colleges, who work with sort of the least privileged students, who work typically with the least well-prepared students, who work with the most remarkably diverse array of students by race, by gender, by family status, by age, by prior experience. Those students are met by the least well-supported faculty. They're met with schools that have the fewest resources to accommodate them and to care for them. So we may end up creating college for all, but I think we're going to have continuing differences in what the definition of college is that we offer. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And that parallels what I just said a minute ago about doctoral programs. You can get a PhD from a lot of places, but they mean different things.
Yeah. And so this, we also have the technology sort of aspect of this rising too, where it seems people are kind of willing to consume information without the sort of sign off of a university. People don't mind if the Wikipedia article is based on an encyclopedia from the 1800s, as long as it tells them what a tulip is or something, Has the university, because of some of these issues, lost its stamp of authority?
That's an interesting question. I think that, the historical model of higher ed is a place to go acquire a scarce resource, which is knowledge. Right? Knowledge was hard to find.
Mm-hmm.
And now information is no longer scarce. Right? Yeah. Information is everywhere. Information is ubiquitous. And so this model of providing young people access to something that they couldn't have, that part of it's lost, right? You can totally, I get pop-up ads every time I open my mail for masterclass, right? Where I can spend $180 and get complete range of access to basketball classes by Steph Curry and directing classes by Martin Scorsese, and acting classes by Helen Mirren. And those are high quality experiences, right? Those are valuable. Those are important. And so since that range of information about the world, often brought to us by really smart, really accomplished people, is now ubiquitous, then what does college offer that isn't that? Right? What is it that the experience of declaring yourself to be a member of this community for 4 years offers that I can't get by watching YouTube videos? Right?
Yeah.
And that's a question that I think we haven't grappled with that yet. We're used to protecting the scarce resource of knowledge. And now, that's, everybody's got that.
Yeah.
So what do we do? What are we offering instead? What are we offering of value? Right.
Yeah. And it's a fascinating question. And something, that universities are trying to deal with in their own way. And it'll be very interesting to see going forward what that looks like. Now, you mentioned a little bit about your sort of journey and how you've just come to terms, or just recently are coming to terms with what has been, I don't really like the word, but career, what has been your journey on this. Can you maybe give some advice to listeners on what got you through that journey, or things that worked for you as you were considering your time in higher ed?
Yeah. Well, I'm not going to hold myself up as a model of mental health. I really struggled with this, right? I really went through a sort of ongoing period of having to imagine myself as a different person and not knowing how to do that, right? And so the easy thing to do is to stay close, to pretend that I'm still that kind of a person, right? So I was working in Boston as an administrator at the Boston Architectural College, and I had started dating the woman who would eventually be my wife, and she was living in and was committed to a little bitty village in Vermont, about 750 people. And so I would leave Boston on Friday afternoon and drive to Vermont and spend the weekend, and then I would leave Vermont on Sunday afternoon and drive back to Boston for the rest of the week. And I did that for years. And we got married in 2011, and I kept doing it. And we bought a house here in Vermont in 2012, and I kept doing it. And finally, in 2013, I said, I can't do this anymore. I need to live at home with the person I love. And so by this point, I was nearly 60 years old. I'd had a long career behind me. I've always had another job. And Nora had her career. We had a little savings built up. We thought we would be safe. being able to do a little bit of work here and there on contract and keep the wolf from the door. And so finally in 2013, I was able to hand in my keys and my ID card and walk out the door. And that was really the moment at which I got to decide, I'm still the same person. I'm still a good writer. I'm still smart. I'm still kind. I'm still trying to do the best I can in a difficult world. Maybe there's other ways to do it. And that really has enabled me to throw myself into my writing without the need for somebody else's vote of confidence about it. It's just who I am. It's just what I do.
It's interesting too, because that's so tied to the academic world, is you're always being peer reviewed or checked off on. That's an interesting comment. How is that different now that you don't have that? You feel more free to create?
Absolutely. I get up in the morning. I've usually got 2 or 3 interesting projects kind of going on at once. And it's a chance for me to decide my own values, right? What is it among the 3 dozen things that I could do today? What is it that would make me feel like I'm making a contribution? One of the things that happened after I moved to Vermont is that I ran for and was elected to the select board of our little community. I've learned more in the last 5 years about buying road salt than you can possibly imagine. But that's another way of being a contributor, of helping to use what I've acquired over all these years, which is how to manage an organization and how to supervise people. I now have another mode for being able to do that. I can write instead of having to write for a scholarly journal. I can be a manager on behalf of my neighbors as opposed to on behalf of an industry that doesn't really care about me. It's really allowed me to discover why the things that I wanted to do mattered.
And looking back, I mean, this is kind of a silly question. I don't know, maybe you'll get it along the way, but looking back on this sort of higher ed journey, and you had an interesting life even before you decided to go to higher ed and in pursuing your dreams elsewhere. Yeah. Would you go through the higher ed thing again?
Well, I mean, the easy and sort of trivial answer is that every mistake you ever made brings you where you are now. Right? And so I wouldn't trade the life that I have today for anything else. The other thing that I really, really want to be clear about is that the time that I did spend in my doctoral program, both as a student and as a burgeoning researcher doing my dissertation, was probably the best 5 years of my life. I loved it. I loved every second of it. I would do it again tomorrow. The opportunities that I've had to be in the classroom as a postdoc at Duke, as a sort of course-by-course teacher when I was working as an administrator, I love classrooms. I love being part of having that conversation with young people and helping them see something, put a name on something they've seen 1,000 times, right? That's always the best thing you could ever say to me after class is, I've seen that 1,000,000 times. I never thought about it. Man, that's a home run there.
Oh, yeah.
And so having had the privilege of having that experience, you bet I'd do that again. Right? It is a way of life really unlike any other. So would I have done it differently? Probably. I might have chosen a different program. I certainly wouldn't have chosen an interdisciplinary doctoral program because hiring gets done by departments. Right? And departments like to hire people who come from their discipline, right? I was told once I had a meeting with a really, really senior scholar in cultural geography, and I was writing my dissertation. He said like 5 times during our talk, he said, "This is just fabulous work. Are you sure this isn't work in cultural geography?" This is and my minor in grad school was cultural geography, so of course I was using the vocabulary. I was using those resources. I was framing my work in that body of theory. And so I was completely buoyed by this conversation, right? He was telling me how wonderful this was and how great I was. And at the end I said, "Well, do you think there's any chance that I might be able to get a faculty position in geography someday?" And he looked at me like I'd asked him about being a temp surgeon. Right? He's like, "Without a degree in geography? No."
Mm.
right? So those are the kinds of things nobody told us.
Mm-hmm.
Right? You know, that we are wonderful offspring of two different species parents, but we're likely to be sterile. You know, we're the mule that came from the horse and the donkey. You know, we can get some work done, but we're never going to have a family of our own. Right? So those are the things that I wish I had known better. I absolutely would have done it again, but I would have done it smarter. I would have done it with some other resources. I would have made different choices about how to position myself and present myself. And even with that, right, again, that's the sort of false agency question.
Mm-hmm.
If I had done all that, would my career have been different? Who the hell knows? Right?
Yeah.
That's the point. You can do everything right and still be left on the side of the road.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And that knowledge and those sort of things that you wish you had known come out in your books, and we'll definitely link to those. We're getting towards the end of the segment here where we each offer a suggestion to the listeners of the Hour of History podcast. It can be anything under the sun. Would you like to go first, Herb?
Oh, gosh. So one of my suggestions related to what we're talking about is to try to identify for yourself in a really root way what you value doing. Because you'll be able to figure out multiple ways of doing that. Right? When I was a kid, when I was 11 or 12 years old, my very first desire for a career was to be a Lutheran minister. I loved the pastor of our church. I thought he was just a terrific, kind, wonderful man, and that was the direction I wanted to go. And in subsequent years, I lost that desire. I lost that faith altogether. But being a college teacher, I got to have exactly that job. I got to read important texts and think about what they meant. I got to counsel people who were in need. I got to do public speaking. I got to do writing something important every week. I had exactly that job, but it had a different job title. So my advice would be, my suggestion would be, really think about the way of life that you value and be open to the fact that that might come from a different venue than you ever expected.
Fantastic. That is a very tough sort of suggestion to follow up, because it's poignant and it's important. So I'll edge on the side of less commercial than I normally do as well, to kind of match the theme a little bit. I'm going to say one of the things that has made my PhD process much less painful than I think it is for some people is the open lines of communication that I've kept and developed. And this also got me through teaching in a very tough neighborhood, in a very tough school in New York City, is establishing, communication lines with people around you. So like, I'm not talking about social media or Facebook or anything like that. Those are just illusions of connection, but actually calling people and talking to them in the long form, I've found immensely valuable, especially in difficult situations, because, like you said, there's a lot of things that people don't tell you. And sometimes your peers and superiors and, even the new hire can give you a perspective that you didn't consider. But often it only comes out in long conversation.
Yeah, wholeheartedly agree.
Great.
That's one of the things about our career, is that we don't even know what we don't know.
Yeah.
We don't know what questions to ask.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's through those kinds of conversations that we discover the ground that we're standing on. Absolutely agree.
Awesome. Well, it's fabulous to talk to you. It's a great book. The book is called The Adjunct Underclass: How America's Colleges Betrayed Their Faculty, Their Students, and Their Mission. And there's a whole lot of insight in there, whether you're going through the journey or you are just trying to empathize with someone who is, or if you're just curious and a good read. I think it applies to all. So thanks for writing it, and thank you so much for sitting down and chatting with me.
Stephen, thank you very much. I've enjoyed myself enormously. Good luck with your own path.
All right. Thank you very much. And good luck to you out there, listeners, on the Hour of History. It's our world, anytime, any place. So long.
Thanks again for listening. Make sure to check out hourofhistory.com/Rex for all the recommendations mentioned during the show. That's hourofhistory.com/RECS. And if you still haven't gotten your fill of the Hour of History, be sure to head over to our blog at hourofhistory.com/blog, where you'll find topics that were covered in the podcast as well as others. And that concludes this week's episode. We thank you again for listening, and we hope to have you back here next week at the Hour of History podcast.